I want to talk a little bit about the techniques that we use to age a fish using their otolith. Okay, so this is the sagittal otolith. It's the largest one, and I've taken it out of the fish. Now I need to age the fish. For younger fish, we'll use the whole otolith. We won't have to prepare it very well, or we won't do much preparation for it. We'll just take it, and we'll want to have some sort of container that'll hold liquid that has a dark background. So this is a cap off of a jar or something. Works great. So I want this something with a dark background. The otolith goes in here. Now the otolith goes in concave up. So with the focus pointing up, if you've got it concave down, you won't be able to see all the annuli. So concave down looks like this, and concave up is going to look like this. Now, to make everything focus very well under the microscope, we put it in this cap, and then we need to cover it with some kind of liquid. For whole otoliths, I just use distilled water. It works great. It gives you plenty of focus, and it's very easy to read the annuli, and it's easy to work with, and it cleans up nicely. For a little bit better focus, you can use glycerol, which is very benign and works very well for focusing things. It's kind of oily and it's a little bit messier. So for the whole otoliths, I wouldn't even mess with it. I would just use distilled water. Now we put the whole cap underneath the dissecting scope, and we're going to use reflected light. That means light that's coming down from above, and it's bouncing off the bottom of the cap, and it's reflecting through the otolith, as opposed to transmitted light, which is when you mount things to a glass slide, or you put them directly on the stage and light comes from below and goes directly through it. So some structures we use transmitted light, some structures we use reflected light. In my opinion, the best way to age with an otolith is with reflected light in a dark background. Now, a lot of times you have different people that have different techniques, and some techniques are better than others, but these are the techniques that I was taught, and they seem to work very well. So once you have your otolith in your dark cap and you're using reflected light, it's going to look like this. And for younger fish, I would say 4 or 5 years old and younger, that's all you need to do. Of course, you need to get a second reader to verify your age, and that's it. Now, on your older fish, usually rule of thumb, anything around 5 years old and older, you're going to have to crack the otolith in half and look at a cross section. Now, that's sort of the trick to otoliths, is on those older fish, you got to crack them in half. Now, when you crack them in half, you can see all the annuli very clearly, but they have to be cracked properly and prepared properly. And if you don't do that, then you're not going to have as much luck with your otolith. So here's a diagram of an otolith from Secor's manual, and it shows exactly how you want to crack this otolith in half. So if we have an older fish, we're going to want to crack the otolith right through the nucleus. Once we do that, we can take either one of these halves and rotate it, place it under the microscope, and then we can look at the newly exposed face under the microscope, which is going to allow us to count the annuli. So here I've got my otolith, and one way to crack them in half is to just use your thumbnail. So I'm going to crack it so the cross section goes right through the focus. Put your thumb on there and well, can't do it, right? Dr. Heidinger always said that that's the trick to a good ager, somebody who's got a good thumbnail that can crack right in the right spot. Tough to do. Now I happen to have ate that fish, and I know that's a 7 or 8-year-old fish, I can't remember. And I now got an otolith here, which again doesn't look like much on this camera. This is an otolith from a 12-year-old fish. Incredibly thick. But even that 8-year-old one, I couldn't break it across my thumbnail. Sometimes you can. And if you can, good. You're good to go. But another problem with breaking them with your thumbnail is you don't always break it in exactly the right spot that you want. And so the solution is to mount the otolith. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do now. Several different ways that we can mount this. So then you've got something a little bit bigger that's easier to cut in half, and then it makes it much easier to get a cross-section view of the otolith. And on older fish, you have to do that in order to get a precise and accurate age from the otolith. You're going to need some kind of a mold to hold the otolith while you're mounting it. This is a candy mold that I bought. It works really well. You'll notice that I've labeled both the columns and the rows because, of course, you're going to need to be able to keep track of which otolith is which. To prepare the mold, you're going to need a little petroleum jelly, and you're also going to need a Q-tip. Take the Q-tip and paint inside the cells of the mold so that you cover them with petroleum jelly. This will help release the otolith and the mount later on. There may be other things that work very well for a release, but I like petroleum jelly. It works really well. Now we have to prepare the mounting media. We need something to mount these otoliths in. The stuff I like to use is called Envirotex Light. T.D. Van Middlesworth told me about this stuff. It's great. It's very clear. It's very hard, but it has a very low viscosity, so it's very easy to pour, and it's perfect for mounting otoliths. So we have a few things we have to gather to get started. We have our Envirotex, which comes in 2 bottles. One bottle is resin, one bottle is hardener. We've got a couple of vials, one for each of those bottles. We've got a cup that I cut off to stir things in, and a Q-tip with one of the fuzzy parts cut off. Of course, we also have an otolith. So we're going to take and transfer some of each of these bottles into the vials. Now the vials have been marked with the right amount of Envirotex to use for a single otolith. So that's what we're shooting for. But the important thing is that we get exactly the same amount of both resin and hardener in each vial because we want to mix them together in a 1-to-1 ratio. Now that we have equal amounts in each vial, we're going to get our mixing cup out and, of course, dump both vials into the mixing cup. Now we take the Q-tip that's had the fuzzy end cut off and we stir it up. And we need to make sure that we do a good, thorough job of stirring here. Get them both mixed together very well. Once you have the hardener and the resin thoroughly mixed, then you're ready to pour. So find the cell that you're going to use and pour a little of the Envirotex into the cell. Once you've done this, you can take the otolith and put the otolith into the cell as well. Once it's in the cell, you can use the Q-tip to move it around to get it lined up in the way that you'd like. And then you can pour a little more Envirotex on top. Now sometimes the otolith likes to sink to the bottom and it's not quite centered in the mold. And if this is happening, you might want to pour a little Envirotex, let it harden up a little, and then add the otolith. But at this point, all you have to do now is wait and let the stuff harden. Envirotex is not the only media we use. We could also use a clear epoxy. But because the epoxy is a little bit thicker, we can't measure it out by volume. It's easier to use the scale to measure it out. So we start by putting a piece of whey paper on the scale and tearing it. And then we begin with our epoxy resin and we weigh out a known amount. And then we also want a 1-to-1 ratio, so we weigh out the same amount of hardener. You don't have to be perfect, but try to get it in a 1-to-1 ratio. Then you mix and pour just like you did before. After about 24 hours, the media should be hard enough that we can cut the otolith in half. So take your mold and take forceps or anything and just pop that mount right on out. Next, you need to figure out where you want to cut the otolith. So find your spot and then use a marker to draw a line right where you need to make your cut to section the otolith in half. Once you've got your mark, you want to go ahead and clamp the mount in a vise with your mark running parallel to the top of the vise. When it's firmly mounted, take a jeweler's saw and slice right through the media and the otolith right along the mark that you made. Once you get all the way through, you've now cracked your otolith in two and you have a cross section that can be put under the microscope. So another way that you can cut your mounted otolith in half is to use the isomet low-speed saw, which is used for a lot of things, and it's a very precise instrument. You can use the micrometer scale here to make very thin slices, but all we need to do is cut this in half and this will do it. So of course the first thing is you've got to make sure you've got lubrication in your reservoir, and I'm using just regular old water. Sometimes you can add a drop, just a drop of dishwashing liquid, and that will help too, but you've got to have something in here. And then you raise it up and then you look right here and make sure that your blade is dipping in that lubrication. You gotta run lubrication on this blade. These blades are delicate and expensive, and if they're not lubricated, they'll be destroyed in a hurry. One way to check to make sure you've got lubrication is to just turn it on, and you can see the surface of the water moving in here. and you can see that it's wet. Alright, so I have my mounted otolith. I've got my line marking where I want to cut it, and this is the beauty of mounting these. If you just had just the otolith, it would be very difficult to mount it in this chuck here, because the otolith is small and it's not flat. That's sort of the whole point of mounting these in media, is so that you can make a nice flat thing that will fit in this chuck and get it hand tight. Now, of course, I'm looking at my mark where I want to cut, and I want to try to make this parallel to the cutting blade. Of course, I want the line marks where the blade is supposed to cut, and that looks pretty good. And then tighten her down. Now this cannot wiggle once it's in that chuck. If that wiggles or bends or gives way, well, then you're going to have an uneven cut and you may hurt the blade. And so get her nice and tight, but of course you don't want to crack the otolith, so just tight enough and not any tighter. And that feels pretty good. Okay, so now I want to drop this down, and I'm looking sighting right down the blade, and it looks like that blade's going to cut right where I want it to cut. Now, I lift this back up. You never ever start the blade with the object laying on it, because it's not lubricated up here and that will tear up your blade. You start the blade first and then you gently set the arm down. You don't drop the arm down, that also will chip the blade. So now that I'm lined up, I turn it on and I let her go to work. You'll see that I'm running at about speed 4. You see the water moving in the reservoir, indicating that my blade is being lubricated. And then you can see the blade is cutting right through the mount and the otolith. You'll also note we have some weights up here. Of course, you put more weights on and it pushes down harder, but you can't have too many weights because it'll hurt the blade. You've got to be patient when you're cutting with the isomet saw. Okay. Now normally it'll cut right through, the arm will drop down and it'll stop the blade, but it got a little hung up on a piece of schmaltz there. But anyway, there is our nice cross section. One half of the otolith and the other half is right there. Nice smooth cut. Won't require any polishing. Now, if you cut the otolith in half with a jeweler's saw, you might need to polish the edges, which simply means you might need to smooth them down using sandpaper. So, if it looks like you need to polish them, just start with a coarse sandpaper and try to sand it evenly. Using figure eights helps. After you've sanded it with the coarse sandpaper, switch to a very fine sandpaper to polish it. Now after you do this, there's going to be a lot of dust and things still stuck to the otolith. So you want to put it in some kind of a dish and give it a good rinse with distilled water. Flush the otolith section around a little bit, and then wipe it down. And once you do this, you'll have a section that's ready to be aged. Finally, we're ready to age the sectioned otolith. Just like before, we need to put it under some liquid under the dissecting scope, but we need to mount it so the cross section is facing up so we can see the annuli. So to do that, we're going to take some regular old modeling clay and we're going to press it into the bottom of a cap, and this will hold the cross section facing up. Now we need to add a little liquid, and for the cross sections I like to use glycerin. Water does not seem to focus things as well as glycerin at the higher magnifications we're going to use when we do the cross section. So we go ahead and pour the glycerin in on top of the clay, and then we get our otolith cross section that's still in a mount, and we jam it down into the clay with the center of the otolith facing up, and put it under the microscope. Now the key to doing the cross section is the light. Here we have a halogen light with a gooseneck, and we've attached this fiber optic adapter to the end of it. Now this fiber optic adapter is made for a mini mag light, and I've just stuck it on the end and sealed it up with tape. But you see, when I turn on the light, you get the fiber optic light. This is the trick to aging cross sections. So you'll want to take your fiber optic light and just stick it there in the glycerin and move it around to get the light exactly where you want it. Now here is what the cross section looks like under regular light under the dissecting scope. So this cross section is lit from above and you really can't see much, and that's why you have to have the fiber optic light. So if we turn this off and bring in the fiber optic light, now we can control where the light goes, and you can see that it's very easy to see the annuli. The key here is to cover the otolith with glycerin and to direct that light right across the top of the otolith. Here's a different angle, and again you can see across the top, you can clearly see the annuli. Also, you can jam it down next to the otolith and let the light come up through the otolith, and that also can help. Finally, when you're done, make sure you clean off the end of your fiber optic light, and that's it. You've just aged a fish with the otolith cross section.